Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are in Luke chapter 21 today. We're finishing it off, the second half. And we have, just looking back at the YouTube history, and we've been doing this study since October the 11th. Every weekday, or close to every weekday since that time. So it has been quite a while, and we are, now on the last three chapters or so. And I'll be honest, I'm looking forward to getting it all wrapped up and being able to make some other types of videos. And I hope it's been beneficial. I hope it'll be beneficial for people who watch the series later. But if you've been with us the whole time, kudos to you for tolerating me this whole time and just for making it through such a substantial section of Scripture. I believe Luke is the longest book in the New Testament. I think Acts kind of gives it a run for its money, but I think Luke is the longest. Makes sense because Luke wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. But and actually, for some of us, or for some of you, you know that my goal has been to go through the entire New Testament. And it might feel like, wow, you've been doing this for like almost 2 years now, and you've only made it through 4 different books. And I kind of felt the same way until I actually looked up like the word count and the lengths of the books. And technically, like Acts chapter, I think it's like 7, maybe it's 6, is the midway point of the New Testament when it comes to just pure word count. So technically we're close to halfway through, even though we've only covered 4 books out of 27. Now, there's definitely some challenges ahead of us in Romans and Corinthians and Revelation and some other places, but you know what? We'll cross those things as we get to them, and that is still my goal, is to finish up the New Testament. I would definitely like to be able to create some different videos, though, and not do this one every weekday, so they free up some time. But anyway, let's talk about Luke chapter 21. If I ramble on, we'll never get done. I'm going to stray a little bit from my notes in verses 20 through 24. And the reason for that is because the notes are really long. And the reason that they're really long is because they have a lot of historical references and quotations from like Josephus and secular historians that talk about what we've been talking about in Luke 21, which is the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And I debated whether or not to include that here, and I'm not going to include that in its entirety because I did a really long study on Matthew 24, which is the parallel to this chapter. And I think Matthew 24 really covers everything that you need to dig into, everything that you would need to understand this chapter in more complexity. So if you're interested in that level of study, you can go check out the Matthew 24 video, and I think it's like 2 hours long or something. There's at least 2 parts to it. And so that's there. I think we're just going to give more of a brief overview of the destruction of Jerusalem here and save the other stuff for later. But it is in the notes, some of it at least is in the notes in Luke chapter 21, and the notes are available down in the description of this video if you don't have them already. So let's talk about this. Well, let's talk about what we already talked about in the beginning of this chapter. Jesus was with his apostles in the temple, and they're admiring the temple, and Jesus tells them something rather shocking. He says, one day, this temple isn't going to be here anymore. It's going to be destroyed. One stone's not going to sit upon another. And that would have been pretty... the disciples probably would have been taken aback by that, and they asked him specifically, when is that going to happen? And what are the signs when that's going to happen? That's kind of what he's been answering. He's talked about some, I would say, general signs, some signs that will happen leading up to this destruction, but they don't signal the imminent end. Some of those signs were wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, natural disasters, famine, pestilence, false messiahs coming on the scene and deceiving people. But now we're really going to get into some more specific signs that are going to signal that the temple's destruction is right around the corner. And when the disciples and the followers of Jesus see these signs, they need to take note of them, and they need to take action based on what Jesus is about to tell them. So that brings us to verse 20. Jesus says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." There's a lot to talk about in just verse 20. Jesus talks about the city of Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Well, when is that going to happen? Well, as we've already mentioned, it's going to happen in 70 AD. It's about 40 years after Jesus is saying these things to his disciples. God was going to send the Romans to punish the Jews for their wickedness, and they were going to come, and they were going to come in. It was an interesting set of events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem. There was this Roman general. His name was Vespasian, and Vespasian had control of a large amount of the Roman army, and there were a number of rebellions, really a widespread rebellion of the Jewish people all throughout Judea and throughout Galilee. And the Jews had been rebellious and kind of troublemaking and hard to control for the Romans for a long time. But this rebellion was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So there's this rebellion that's going on, and Vespasian brings his army to Galilee and to Judea and this area of the world to just squash this thing once and for all. So Vespasian is moving south, squashing these rebellions and punishing these Jews around this area of the world, and eventually he finally gets to the Jewish capital, which is Jerusalem, and he has decided that Jerusalem is going to be punished for what they've done. But the Jews have held up in Jerusalem, and they're intending to fight. Well, Vespasian, he surrounds the city with his army. Back in those days, a lot of times you didn't attack a city directly. You would lay siege to the city. You would surround it. You would cut off any entrances to the city. You would cut off their resources, their food, their water, and you would basically just starve them out. And really the hope was that they would just surrender, give up, and then they would probably become your slaves. You'd sell them, or they'd be punished somehow or another. But ideally, and that would be good for the besieging army, because they wouldn't lose troops in the assault. And so it was one of the ways that they did warfare back then. Just surround the city, cut off the resources, starve them out. So that's what Vespasian has planned to do. He brings his army up to Jerusalem, prepares to besiege the city. But then there's a really interesting set of events that happens not in the area of Judea, but over in Rome. Nero, who was the Roman emperor, he dies. And all of a sudden, there's no one on the throne of Rome. No, there is no emperor. So there's several people who have their eye on the throne, obviously, and Vespasian is one of them. So he's not ready to go and claim the throne yet, but he's watching it, and he decides that it's not the opportune moment to lay siege to Jerusalem, just in case maybe something comes up and he needs to go back to Rome, or he needs to ally himself with a certain contender for the emperorship. So he says, you know what, we'll wait on this attack. So he then pulls his armies back from Jerusalem. And long story short, there are 3 men who claim the throne of Rome, if I can remember their names: Otho, Galba, and I think it's Vitellius. Those 3 guys, they all become emperor, and they all die very, very quickly. I think they're all killed, assassinated, betrayed. One of them might have just been banished. I can't remember off the top of my head, but anyway, 3 of these guys become emperor very quickly, and then all of a sudden 3 of them are off the throne. And another guy who's had his eye on the throne is Vespasian. So after those 3 guys get axed, Vespasian takes the throne of Rome. So no longer is his interest really in the punishing of the Jews in Jerusalem. He's got bigger fish to fry now. He needs to secure the throne, so he goes back to Rome. He secures it for himself. His first priority is Egypt and Alexandria. And then he wants to finally he turns his attention back to the Jews because he's not going to let them go completely unpunished. And he wants to tie up loose ends there. So he doesn't go directly, but he sends his son Titus, and Titus then lays siege to the city of Jerusalem. Now, what on earth does all this have to do with what Jesus is talking about? Well, he's prophesying about these events. He's giving his apostles the signs, and he's also going to be giving them a way of escape out of this massacre that is going to happen in Jerusalem, right? So there's going to be believers, disciples who are in Jerusalem when these events take place, and he's going to tell them how to get out of the way before they end up being starved to death or killed by the Romans or having to endure the punishment that's coming on the rebellious Jews. So that's what he mentions here in verse 20. He says, "Look for this sign when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies." When you see that, you're going to know that it's about to be destroyed real soon. And then verse 21. "When you see that, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter into it. For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written." He tells them, when you see this, get out of Jerusalem, get out of Judea, get out of this area, and do not come back. If there's anyone who is outside of the city, do not let them return for anything. There's nothing valuable enough that they could want to return to take this kind of risk. The reason is because Vespasian pulls his armies back, but then he sends his son Titus back, and he surrounds the city again. So the Jews, when they saw Vespasian pull back originally, they probably thought, we're safe. We didn't get destroyed like Jesus prophesied. But what they didn't realize was that Titus was coming back to finish the job, and he would surround the city again. And so Titus surrounds the city, and there are people locked up inside, Jews locked up inside. And what's even worse about the whole scene was that there were warring factions of Jews within the city. So there was no safety for some of the innocents within. There was no safety on the outside because the Romans were there, and there was no safety on the inside because these warring factions were taking advantage of people and doing horrible things to people. If you go back and read the history, or you do the Matthew chapter 24 study, you can dig into all that, right? So it's just a horrible scene. There's horror inside, there's horror outside, and Jesus is telling people to get out as quickly as they possibly can. Let's read verse 22 and 23, or 23. "Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." There were going to be a couple occasions when the Jews could escape the city, even after Titus had surrounded it. Josephus writes that there were several occasions when Titus just let people go who escaped Jerusalem and were running for their lives. They were trying to get out of the city because the warring factions within were doing terrible things to them. So they were fleeing, and in some cases Titus was letting them go, or there were doors, there were opportunities for escape. But the Jews had to take those opportunities as quickly as they saw them because they were very quickly shut down. The warring factions inside the city were trying to keep people inside, and they were killing deserters who were attempting to leave. So these windows of opportunity were very short, and Jesus kind of, we see how important it was for them to take the opportunities that they had and how little time they had to escape. And in verse 23, when he says, "Alas for women who are pregnant, alas for mothers who are nursing in those days," for obvious reasons. Having a baby or being pregnant would slow somebody down, and they couldn't afford to be slowed down by anything. He describes the state of the city during the siege as great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. So he describes it in verse 22 as a day of vengeance and a day of wrath in 23, and that's obvious. That's God's vengeance. Yes, it was the Roman army who was sent to do this, right? But they were representing the wrath of God in the actions that they were taking. And we know that God can work providentially through the nations to bring about his will and to bring about his judgment and to pour out his wrath on people. Let's see. The end of verse 24. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There's a lot of discussion about the end of that verse where it says the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, but I think maybe the easiest way to understand it, and there may be more to it than this, but basically until God has accomplished his work through those Gentiles. The Jews looked down on the Gentiles, remember, and yet they were going to be the ones who came against them and punished them. The Jews for a long time relied on their heritage that, oh, we're Jews, we're right with God, and that's our protection. Certainly, God favors us over the Gentiles, but because of their wickedness, God ends up using the people who they despise to punish them. And that brings us to verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Matthew, in his account, records a very similar statement. Let me read it. Matthew 24, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. These verses have been a point of a lot of debate and a lot of discussion over the years, and you'll hear a lot of people sometimes quote these verses talking about the end of the world. And when you talk about the sun being dark and the stars falling, it kind of sounds like end of the world kind of language. We see a little bit of this in the book of Revelation, and I think that's part of the reason that people associate it with the end of the world. But we have to read a little bit further in the text. Well, if we do read a little bit further in the text, it will be revealed to us that Jesus is not talking about the end of the world here. We see in Matthew, actually, let me read the quotation from Luke first. So if you look down to verse 32, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place." So he says it's going to be within the lifetime of this generation that I'm talking to right now that all the things that I mentioned previous are going to happen. And that would include this stars falling from heaven, powers of the earth being shaken, moon not giving its light. Right? So that can't be the end of the world because we're now 2,000 years past these events that Jesus is describing in the destruction of the temple. So he must be talking in some kind of a figurative language. So as we read down through the rest of this chapter, just keep in mind that everything that Jesus is going to be talking about is going to happen within the lifetime of the apostles. And so don't go making wild interpretations about end of the world apocalyptic kind of events here. Keep it in underneath the qualification that Jesus gives it. Another point to remember here when we go to interpret these verses specifically is that if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you'd actually be familiar with some of this language. And the way that it's used in the Old Testament, it kind of also sounds like end of the world stuff. But there are several occasions when we know the specific events that it's describing, and they're not about the end of the world. Let me read a couple verses that have similar language from the Old Testament prophet. So here's Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 through 10. "Behold, The day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. Notice, for the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. So is Isaiah prophesying the end of the world here? No, we know that these verses are actually about God's punishment on the nation of Babylon. Another one, in Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 7 and 8. When I blot you out, I will cover the heavens and make their stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over you, and put darkness on your land, declares the Lord God. Now, these verses aren't about the end of the world either. These verses are actually about God's punishment and his judgment against the wicked nation of Egypt. Okay, so with this knowledge, how do we go about interpreting verses 25 and 26? Why does Jesus use that here when talking about Jerusalem? Well, Jesus was announcing a judgment on Jerusalem, just like he had with the judgments on Egypt and the judgment on Babylon. And he employs very similar language. And it makes sense that he would employ similar language because he's talking to Jews who are supposed to know the Old Testament. And so this would have really it should have had a powerful impact on Jesus's listening audience because, think about it. Think about you being a Jew and you had been to the synagogue on Saturday and you had heard the scriptures read and you had heard that same language about stars falling and the sun going black, but it had been about Babylon. Well, you would know what? Well, Babylon, they had been destroyed. God had brought his judgments against them. And you had also heard that about Egypt. And what had happened to Egypt? Well, they had been destroyed. So it'd be pretty frightening to hear Jesus utilizing the exact same Jewish judgment language to describe the fate of your homeland and your people, the Jewish people. And I think there's a good application here is that we need to put ourselves into the shoes of first century Jews when we read the Bible and we want to understand the New Testament. Familiarizing ourselves with the Old Testament can really help us to get some insights into the New, because if you don't know those passages from the Old Testament, then you're going to think that this is talking about the end of the world, and you're going to trend towards interpreting it that way. But when you see the language has been utilized many times in the Old Testament just to talk about the judgment of nations, then it clicks into place and say, no, Jesus isn't talking about the end of the world here. We don't need to go flying off into those kinds of interpretations. It makes perfect sense if you know those Old Testament passages. So that's why we have to read the Old Testament. He mentions the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. So what is that about? Well, the Son of Man, that title is really interesting. It's one that's used several times in the Old Testament. Ezekiel is often called the Son of Man by God. But there's one specific reference, a very important reference, to someone entitled the Son of Man back in the book of Daniel. And I don't have it in my notes here, but let me find it really quick. Son of Man. If we can get through all the Ezekiel texts here. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given, notice, dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So when the Jews heard this term, Son of Man, they knew that it referred to this special individual back in the book of Daniel, this one who would come and who would rule, who would have a kingdom given to him by God that would never be destroyed. And they associated this with the messianic figure. So Jesus here, when he's talking about the Son of Man, he's referring to himself. And he says that he is going to come. That figure is going to come in the clouds with power and great glory, exactly like he's described in Daniel chapter 7. So what does Jesus mean here? Does he mean that he's literally going to come to the earth? He's going to make an appearance when Jerusalem is destroyed? Well, to my knowledge, there's no record of anyone claiming to have witnessed anything like, some kind of appearance of Jesus. I think I would suggest that this passage needs to be interpreted figuratively. That Jesus is coming in his glory and his power. He's coming on his throne to accomplish his will. The Jews thought that they were going to be just fine, that their temple had a bright future, that they could reject the Messiah and get away with it. And here comes the Son of Man sitting on his throne in all of his power and saying, no, you thought you killed me. You thought you rid yourselves of me, but I'm actually still on the throne, and now I'm going to bring my judgment against you and pour out my wrath against you. Not a literal coming or a visible coming, but a figurative coming. A figurative display of that power that he possessed. So the Son of Man, he would come in 70 AD. He would accomplish God's will in the city. He would arrive with a display of power and glory, not a personal arrival, but representatively through the Roman Empire. Jesus determined when and how Jerusalem would fall. Even though he used the Romans, even though he used human minds and human military strategy, and the Romans probably thought that they were accomplishing their own ends when they destroyed Jerusalem, in the spiritual reality, they were actually accomplishing what Jesus wanted them to accomplish and bringing about his judgment. Let's see. Okay, verse 28. Well, let's go to verse 28. Now, when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. So the apostles we talked about had asked about the signs that were going to lead up to the destruction of the temple. And in the last few verses, Jesus has described several of them. He says that when they started to recognize these signs, they were to, quote, straighten up and raise their heads. They needed to be alert, because it says their redemption, their salvation from the upcoming horrors in Jerusalem depended on their recognition of these signs. They were going to be saved if they took notice of these things and took the appropriate actions. I think this redemption could potentially also refer to just Jesus' disciples' deliverance from their Jewish persecutors. The Jewish leaders persecuted the church like from day one, and basing themselves in Jerusalem. They would even send people out all over the world to persecute Christians and to try to discredit them. The destruction of Jerusalem was, in part, Jesus saving his disciples from the hardships that the Jews inflicted on them. So there's a redemption in that sense as well. Let's read verses 29 through 31. And he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also, when you see these things take place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. So this is a really simple but effective illustration to drive home the point. If you missed our lengthy discussion on fig tree botany, you may be interested in taking a look at that in Matthew 21. You can go check that out to understand fig trees in Palestine a little bit better. But the new leaves on a fig tree, they start to become visible in like late March and early April. And so the appearance of the fig leaves indicate that summer is right around the corner. Now, in the same way, The appearance of these signs that Jesus is describing would indicate that Jerusalem's judgment was right around the corner. And when the apostles saw these signs, they would know that the kingdom of God was near, that the Son of Man on the throne over this king was advancing on Jerusalem to destroy those who opposed his reign as the Messiah. Verse 32 and 33. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So again, just a reminder, we've already talked about this verse. Everything that we've read above this, all of these signs and these events are going to happen within the lifetime of the apostles. So they need to be interpreted that way, and they need to be interpreted consistently under that qualification. In verse 33, Jesus, he affirms the security of this prophecy. This is something they can bank on. This is not something that they need to doubt. It's good as gold. Jesus' words were more sure than the earth that the apostles were standing on or the heavens that hung above them. He said that the earth would sooner pass away, the sky would sooner dissolve than his words not come true. And one day, the earth will be gone and the sky will be gone, but Jesus' words and his truths will remain. Verse 34 through 36 now. But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all of these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Jesus is again saying that the apostles need to be watchful. They weren't to get caught up in drunkenness or dissipation. Now, drunkenness, I'm pretty sure I know what that one is. Dissipation, that's not a word I use very much. It's the squandering of money, energy, or resources. So kind of like wastefulness, like not thinking about the future and just squandering things. So, if you're squandering opportunities, squandering the blessings that have been given to you, if you're drunk and you're out of your mind, you're not sober, you're not paying attention, you're not thinking about the future. And the apostles needed to be thinking about the future because these signs were going to be coming and they needed to be alert. If they were distracted with all the cares of the world, distracted people they miss things, or they walk into traps, or they end up hurting themselves because they're not paying attention. You ever seen those videos on YouTube where it shows a bunch of people who are like on their cell phones and they end up like falling into a creek, or like I saw one where there was like a fountain in a mall and the guy just walks straight into the fountain and because he's distracted, so he's missing the things that are around him. Well, spiritually distracted people miss things. And they walk into Satan's traps. The apostles couldn't afford that because it was going to cost them their lives. It says, for it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Some people think that this verse, being after the verse that talks about everything happening in this generation, believe that this verse is talking about the last and final judgment. And that's possible. But I think it's also possible that it's talking about the destruction of the temple. But how can that be? It says that these things are going to happen or to all people who dwell on the face of the whole earth. The invasion of Jerusalem and Judea was, a somewhat localized event. It just happened, over there on the east side of the Mediterranean Sea. So how can we say that it affected the whole earth? Well, that term, the whole earth, is sometimes used to talk about just like the totality of a group of people. We see it in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, where it says, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Well, Caesar Augustus had control of a lot of people, but not the whole world. The phrase was used to basically denote the totality of his empire. And it may be that it's used kind of in a similar way here, talking about the totality of the people in Judea and in Jerusalem, that all this suffering and this judgment would come upon them. An application here, as we think about what happened to the Jews and why it happened, and as we, who live 2,000 years later, think about the judgment at the end of time and some parallels between the two. There are definitely a lot of parallels between the judgment on Jerusalem and the judgment at the end of the world. And I don't think that I think that God maybe intended that. Like, we are able to look back at the Jews and what happened to them and receive some warnings. It's a cautionary tale about what will happen to us if we too reject God's anointed one, God's Messiah. If we reject the Son of Man, if we fight against his kingdom that he is enthroned within. Consider these parallels. So Jesus promised to judge the Jewish nation in the future. And so too, God promises to judge the world in the future at the end of time. The judgment of Jerusalem was a result of their sins. And that will be true of us as well. God has to judge the world because sin can't go unpunished because he's a God of justice. And his wrath will be poured out on those who didn't follow his instructions, and those who resisted him, those who rebelled against him. The wicked Jews, they were punished when the Son of Man came representatively through the Romans in 70 AD. But our warning is that we're going to have to stand before the Son of Man when he returns, not representatively, but in person, to judge the world at the end of time. Parallel number 4, Jesus offered his Jewish listeners a way of escape from the judgment of Jerusalem. And so too, Jesus offers us a way of escape from the judgment of sin, and that's through him, following his instructions, just like the apostles were supposed to do to get out of the city. Parallel number 5. The judgment of Jerusalem was going to be a punishment for the wicked Jews, but as Jesus described it, it was going to be a day of redemption for the disciples. Their lives were going to be spared if they followed his instructions, and they were going to have redemption and freedom from their Jewish persecutors. And so too with us, the final day of judgment will be a day of redemption for the faithful, and a time of relief and rest from our persecutors. And then the last parallel, Jesus told his apostles to be watchful in order to escape the coming judgment of their nation. And Jesus has been talking about that in the Gospel of Luke. Be watchful, be careful, be looking towards the future, be sober-minded, because you don't know when the Son of Man is returning. You don't know when Jesus is coming back. And you need to be ready at all times. You can't be involved in drunkenness and dissipation. There are probably a lot of other parallels, but I think these are sufficient to show the similarities. The Jews probably never thought that they would be judged like the nations that they read about in the Old Testament. And a lot of them probably scoffed at the idea that God would ever destroy his, quote, holy city of Jerusalem. But they were wrong. And what we need to learn from that is that the kingdom of God will put down any nation. It will put down any individual that opposes its reign. The Jews were not accepted. We will not be accepted. Our nation, no matter how much we love it, no matter how faithful it has been in the past, no nation is exempt from God's punishment. And if that nation lifts itself up in pride, it too will be brought down, just like all the others. I mean, that is the precedent of history again and again and again and again. And to think that we're exempt from it would be foolish. It would be not to learn the lesson that history has taught us. So don't get caught off guard thinking that you'll never face judgment or the nation you love will never face judgment. The Son of Man is coming on the clouds of heaven. And the question is, will he find us opposing his kingdom, or will he find us building it up and supporting it? Will you find judgment when he returns, or will you find redemption? All right, let's finish this off with verse 37 and 38. And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and he lodged at the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. So Jesus spent the last week of his life saying things like this. In the last chapter, he's warning against the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the elders, warning people who they didn't need to be. And then this chapter has been a little bit different. Remember, it started off with the widow with 2 mites. He's telling his apostles who they should be, in contrast. And then he's talking about here, giving them a warning of what's coming, and again, driving home the point that they need of who they need to be as far as watchful, sober-minded people, looking towards the future, prepared for the future, and bearing witness to his name, even though persecutions were going to come against them. And he's already guaranteed them that they would be secure through all of this. He's given them a heads up, what they need to know. He says, not a hair of your head is going to be injured. You're eternally secure with me. So while all of God's judgment pours out on this city and on these people, as long as you remain in me, then you're secure. So that's the way that Jesus is finishing off his time on earth. And as we get to as we go through the next couple chapters, we're going to talk about midweek of this week when Jesus is arrested and he's killed, and then the resurrection at the first day of, Sunday after this week is over. And then the ascension after that. And then it's all Luke wrote. So I hope this has been somewhat beneficial to you. There's so much more information in the notes, and I was trying to go through it as concisely as I could without taking a massive amount of time. So if there's something I confused you on, it probably will clear it up if you read through the notes, and so those are available for free on the website, or you can get a physical book. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and Lord willing, I'll talk to you tomorrow as we jump into chapter 22.